Hey, in my last video, I was in Daniel chapter 3, and we talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and how they had the hope in the fire next to them. And today we're going to be talking about Daniel chapter 4 and King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, one thing that's of note is what they told King Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 3 was that our God is able to save us from this. But even if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow down. And I mentioned in my other video that Nebuchadnezzar was going to get his just deserts. Well, it happens in this chapter. Nebuchadnezzar was a mighty king. He was a powerful king. And in 605 BC, he defeated Pharaoh Necho of Egypt and brought Judah under his control. There was a buddy of mine named Cliff Murchison. We called him Merk. He posed a question on Facebook last week. He says, why is it that some people believe that God only speaks or works through them? And I went to answer the question. I said, this is a tough one, man, because I can't speak to the why, because you would have to go into people's thought processes and figure out why they think this. If I had to nail it down, it'd probably be like a branding type thing, like our denomination is right because of this, or yours is wrong because of this. I don't know. So can't answer the why, but I will say this. In the Bible, God uses various types of people from various backgrounds. Rahab was a prostitute, and she was not even an Israelite, but she is listed in the lineage of Christ. Nebuchadnezzar was an oppressive, terrible ruler. He was arrogant. He was pompous. He did some terrible things, but he wrote some verses in the Bible. Daniel chapter 4, the first, 18 verses, and then later on in the chapter, were actually written by Nebuchadnezzar. Saul persecuted the Christian church, and then he went on to write the bulk of the New Testament. And so God uses people, and God has a way of getting people's attention, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. It was during the time when the first Jewish captives were carried away to Babylon. We know about Daniel. We know about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And all this took place. It was actually fulfilling prophecy. Way back 100 years before, King Hezekiah prophesied this. Isaiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah and asked, what did those men say, and where did they come from? From a distant land, Hezekiah replied. They came to me from Babylon. The prophet asked, what did they see in your palace? They saw everything in my palace, Hezekiah said. There's nothing among my treasures that I did not show them. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord Almighty. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, thus saith the Lord. So this is something that was prophesied by God. This is something that God allowed to happen. This is something that God willed to happen. That's something that we need to get our minds around, is God does allow things to happen. It's within the framework of God's will for things to happen. I know this was a terrible time in Jewish history, in the history of the Hebrew people, but you gotta understand, even though they were in exile, even though Nebuchadnezzar was a terrible, oppressive ruler, God had not abandoned them. Under Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Babylon, history records this, Babylon pretty much crushed all their enemies. He never lost a battle. And he was genuinely benevolent to the people that he conquered. But personally, he was cruel, he was violent, he was vindictive. Jeremiah tells us that he roasted two young men in a fire. It says, because of them, all the exiles of Judah who are in Babylon will use this curse. May the Lord treat you like Zedekiah and Ahab, whom the king of Babylon burned in the fire. That's just the type of guy he was. Of course, we know that he threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire because they refused to bow down to an idol. And again, in his final conquest of Jerusalem, he had King Zedekiah's son, or both of his sons. It says in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped out of the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And in that time, if you haven't read the story, it's crazy. It's in 2 Kings 25. Nebuchadnezzar did some terrible things, and he killed Zedekiah's sons right before his eyes. And then he put out the king's eyes before taking him to Babylon. Crazy stuff. So could such a cold, heartless individual be changed by God's discipline? Could God reach down and actually touch an individual like that? Now, we all know some people that just say, You ever prayed, Lord, I just pray that you'll get a hold of this person. You ever really thought about that prayer? If you prayed that, Lord, if you'll just get a hold of that person. Sometimes some serious stuff happens when the Lord gets a hold of some people. But the Bible tells us in Daniel that, the Lord had convicted Nebuchadnezzar at least on 2 counts previous to this. In Daniel 2, after he's had a dream interpreted, Nebuchadnezzar said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." And we know that whenever he saw 4 men walking around in the furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it says they trusted, or God, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they trusted in him, defied the king's commands, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation, of any language, who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into a pile of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. This is the God that Nebuchadnezzar was dealing with, and you better believe that that God could get someone's attention. And so chapter 4 opens with Nebuchadnezzar telling about how what had happened to him. It says, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous." Babylon was fortified. He had a mighty army to defend her. He had nothing to fear. He was safe and he was secure. He didn't have a care in the world, right? Well, in history, throughout the history of the Bible, throughout the history of the world, really, God has used various methods for getting folks' attention. Okay? Moses, he came upon this bush that was on fire, yet it wasn't being burned up, and a voice rang forth from the bush, told him to take off his shoes for where he was standing was holy ground. And then, in other ways, Paul or Saul was blinded on the road to Damascus. That's a pretty good way of getting someone's attention. But to settle the proud and boastful king of Babylon, God used a simple dream. Nebuchadnezzar was so disturbed over the dream that he called his wise men to interpret the dream. Of course, we know, according to chapter 2, that was going to fail. So he should have just called Daniel all along. But this is what the dream said. It said, "These are the visions I saw while lying in bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top was touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it, the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it, every creature was fed. In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, 'Cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it, and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. The decision is announced by the messengers. The holy ones declare this verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people." God commanded that the tree be cut down. Through God's power, Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and Daniel told the king that the tree that had grown so strong and so powerful was him. And the cutting down of the tree to a stump meant that Nebuchadnezzar would be driven from among men and would live with the animals. And that's exactly what happened. And of course, the kingdom would be kept secure for him, but Daniel told the king that God would do this to humble the arrogant king, so he would know what? That the Most High is sovereign, and the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and he's the one that gives it to whoever he chooses. Daniel warned him, he said, unless you turn away from your sin and you turn towards righteousness, you turn towards the Lord's kingdom, then your kingdom is going to be taken away. And none of what Daniel described had to happen. However, he didn't listen. And a year later, every detail of Daniel's prophecy came true. And we don't have time to read it all, but read this chapter. It is an amazing chapter. As Nebuchadnezzar walked through his palace and he admired everything that he had done, he admired all of his accomplishments, and he failed to acknowledge that it was God who had raised him up to rule over Babylon. Something happened. But at the end of the 7-year period, Nebuchadnezzar's illness left him just as quickly as it came. And he looked up to the heavens, and his understanding returned to him, and he immediately began to proclaim the glory of God. He also worshiped God, and every indication is that he continued to do this throughout the remainder of his life. You see, the picture here is that this once wicked, cruel king, what happened is he became a true believer in God. So what does this mean? One of the most important lessons, of course, is the sovereignty of God. That no matter what's going on, no matter who's in charge, no matter where you agree with the government or not, that matter, God is in control. Nebuchadnezzar was lifted up with pride, but God humbled him through this terrible, where he lost his mind. He was acting like a dog. He was barking up trees and stuff like that. It was crazy, this high and mighty, powerful being, really. He was in people's eyes, he was more than a man. He was almost a god. He had so much power. But this terrible, he just went crazy. He lost his mind. And he was forced to acknowledge that God is sovereign. Nebuchadnezzar learned that the sky is not the limit. God is the limit. And one day he's sitting there, he's admiring all of his accomplishments, and the next moment he is eating grass like a cow. And 7 years later, his mouth's still full of grass. He looks up into heaven and it goes away. Solomon wrote this. He said, many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. Now, there's nothing wrong with making plans. There's nothing wrong with having dreams for the future, but those plans had better start and they'd better end with God. Years ago, it was common for people to end their letters that they were writing with 2 letters, DV, which stood for the Latin phrase Deo volente, meaning God willing. That should be our attitude, and that should be our daily prayer, God willing. Louisiana, we say God willing and the creeks don't rise. James chapter 4, and we'll end with this. Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and we will do this or that. I know that there are some scary things going on right now. I know that. But God's got this. If God can take the most powerful ruler of the most powerful empire and take him down to his knees, God can take something like COVID-19. God can take something like the economic crisis, and he can make it okay because he's got this. And I know that there's someone in your life that is stubborn, that you've been praying for, and you want them to see the glory of God. You want them to have the peace that he has to offer. You want them to just believe so that they can be blessed and have the same blessing that you have. Great. That's awesome. God can do it. We just have to trust that he can do it. If it's the Lord's will, we'll live and we'll do this or do that. God bless.